So I do enjoy kind of having conversations with people who don't believe and atheists, or having something and when people just want to ask questions about the faith. And what I've come to realize, and I'm sure you know, is how difficult it really is to pay attention and to understand what the question the person is asking. Because we filter it through all kinds of things, and then we give an answer back, and then we realize that a lot of times, and I'm sure parents feel this way when they're talking with the children, is that we're not talking on the same level. You know, we're using the same words, but we have different definitions of what we mean by these words, and we think we're communicating, and we realize we're not communicating at all. And it's always a difficult thing. Husbands and wives must have that same situation, where there's this lack of communication. And you can see that going on in today's gospel, because Jesus is talking about being born again. And of course, you know, then Nicodemus is like, well, how can you be born again when you're old? And of course, he's talking about, you know, giving birth and being born. And Jesus is talking about being born again, being born of the Spirit, having a new life, having, you know, the old life dying and a new life rising, being born anew, you know. And so you see this, you know, this real, difference in even how they're using the words and the confusion that happens. It happens all the time in our faith as well. You know, we realize that when we're talking to each other about even God, we come with different definitions of God, and oftentimes they're not even the definitions the church has of what God is. Difficult thing is always when we say something like, well, you know, they often, when people have definitions or ideas, or tell me what you think God is, how are you using these words? They talk about God as a being, as if he's one being among many of the beings that are around, and I'm a being, and you're a being, and God's a being, you know, and so he's like there, and he's, you know, or they say, well, he's not, he's everywhere, but they talk and refer to him as a being. And so oftentimes they would say, well, if God made everything, then who made God? Well, then, of course, then that means you're referring to God as if he's a being that needs to be created. And then that's not what we talk about. That's not the image we have of God. And yet, oftentimes, so even when we talk about heaven and we talk about eternity, my mother used to say things like, what are we going to do in heaven all day? It's like, well, you know, eternity is not about days, you know, and a week and a year, but that's our language. But you could see that there's all this kind of confusion with language, because especially when referring to God, some of these words are more unlike what the truth is than they are like. And it's a hard thing to have a conversation about. Certainly with things like proof for the existence of God, they talk about proofs. And they're like, well, you can prove it. I was like, well, what do you mean by prove? What do you want? What do you want? And they often will say, like, science proves. Science proves, you know, that there was evolution, or that we came and say, well, they don't prove that. They have evidence of that, you know, and if we get more and more evidence, and our faith comes based on evidence, not on proof. And most of the whole arguments are really using that word proof as if that's like math, you know, and not like evidence, where we look around the world and you find evidence of different things that we come to the conclusion of. But yet we have all this wrong language, and you sometimes spend some time watching people arguing over in YouTube or something like that over faith and stuff, and you realize it happened to Jesus, it continues to happen. And when we get into these debates, the better thing is to just to figure out, what are you talking about when you're using those words? And then oftentimes you realize we really do agree with we really do agree when you agree with the definitions of the words. And I would think even Nicodemus would have agreed with Jesus if he understood what Jesus meant by being born again. So I just share that with you as we continue, our faith life and having discussions with people, to make sure that trying to understand what you mean, as opposed to quickly filtering it through our own definitions. And I think we can go a long way with sharing the gospel, and certainly the faith that we as Catholics have, which is very, very deep.